Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Acumen Group's Pop Youth Screenings. This is Dr. Shantella Sherman, and today, thank you so much for joining me. This is a quick talk and a little PowerPoint to kind of reacclimate you guys to the documentary Belly of the Beast and to also get give you the opportunity to ask questions that you may have about eugenics, about the screening itself, some of the content that's within the screening, and to give you an opportunity to kind of decompress, I guess, from much of the information that you may have learned within that broadcast. So, again, welcome. And to kick things off, what I'm going to do is start out with a PowerPoint that just gives a bit of a brief history of eugenics and how it functions in our penal system, specifically how it relates to incarcerated women, women of color, indigenous women, disenfranchised women, and how a lot of times the rights of these women dissipate once they are in carceral spaces. And by carceral, I mean whether it's a prison itself, a reformatory, it could be an asylum, it can be a mental health facility. Sometimes it could be an ICE detention center. It could be any of a number of agencies where at some point women actually lose the ability to make decisions and govern their own reproductive health. And so with Belly of the Beast, many of you received the link. You were able to do the screener. I hope it didn't traumatize you too much, but these are some of the things that the Acumen Group tends to push forward to ensure that you are able to advocate on behalf of yourself and your loved ones, that you hold your legislators accountable for laws that they are either ignoring, refusing to challenge, or are actively legislating to put into place. And so I want to thank the Acumen Group team and Ms. Stacy Palmer for her assistance with pulling most of this stuff together, to Lee Ross, and again, the rest of the Acumen team. Thank you so much for all of your assistance and the research and pulling much of the information together that we're going to examine. If you have questions, please feel free to pop those questions into the chat so that I'm able to answer the questions as we go. We did have a few questions that came in through a mailbag in the last few days, so I will go through those once we get to the end of the PowerPoint. As always, you're able to visit us at the Acumen Group, www.theacumengroup.org. You're able to visit us on social media. Again, the Acumen Group. You can send me content or information, questions at Doc Shantella through Twitter or through Facebook. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to start the PowerPoint. So for many of you, the idea of eugenic sterilizations is still something that does not necessarily hit home. It's something that folks either talk about in relation to reproductive rights that may include Roe versus Wade, which is abortion legislation, the right of a woman to choose whether or not to have an abortion, things like that. But you rarely ever see eugenic sterilization information come to the forefront as something that you would need to either guard yourself against, to truly advocate against, or to examine in serious ways, because in many instances, once a woman, or any person for that matter, but once women are placed in prisons, often they lose the ability to not only advocate on behalf of themselves, but they lose contact with those outside the prisons who are able to advocate on their behalf. And so it is clearly an imperative that as more African-American women are pushed into carceral states, that we understand what is at stake here. Many of you may have heard the concept of a therapeutic sterilization. These are forced sterilizations that are carried out or have been carried out in history against people who have disabilities. And those disabilities could include anything from the term years ago of being slow, being retarded, having Down syndrome, um, having any type of ailment that would, today we would say ableism, anything that would cause the person not to be what we consider to be quote unquote normal. And as you can tell, normal is on a sliding scale. So many people don't know exactly what that means. But years ago, it was almost entirely at the discretion of a physician or a social health provider to determine whether or not a woman was capable of not only having a baby, but caring for children. And so those decisions were usually made early on in a young woman's life, usually about the time that she started going through puberty. And then she was sent usually to a home for wayward girls, a feeble minded home, a training school. And within those spaces, still considered to be carceral spaces, though they were not prisons, it would be there that she would be given a set of tests or examinations, both mental, physical, developmental, to determine whether or not she was a good candidate to have children. And if it was determined that she was not, for her therapy, for her own benefit, these young ladies would be sterilized. Reproductive autonomy and authority. In 2015, the Guardian newspaper in the UK reported that a 36-year-old mother of six with quote unquote learning disabilities could be sterilized in a ruling that basically said the courts had the right to send law enforcement in to forcibly remove the woman from her home and use necessary restraint in order to get her to a hospital in order to sterilize her because they did not feel she was capable of raising the six children she already had, and they wanted to ensure that she did not have additional children. Now, this same judge, maybe a few years earlier, had decided that a 21-year-old woman with Down syndrome should not be sterilized because she, quote unquote, came from a good home. You start to see that decisions about a woman's right and ability to have children was based solely, often is based solely upon the discretion of a judge, a physician, or someone who has taken over the woman's rights in a custodial type of situation where they become the wards of her reproduction. For those of you, and there are many of you who've contacted me, and one of the questions that was raised was, isn't this the same type of policy, or these are the same types of policies that were enacted on slave plantations because enslaved women did not have the ability to choose, you know, if they were to have children, how many children they were to have, when they would reproduce, who they would reproduce with. They made no choices over their physicality. They made no choices over anything related to their own personal health, the health of their unborn children, or the health of their children once they were born. And the answer to that question, yes, it is very much the same thing in the sense that it was believed then, like now, when women go into carceral spaces, that they don't have the aptitude and that there's always someone who is in authority who knows better about her reproductive rights and her reproductive abilities and capabilities and capacity than she herself does. Involuntary sterilizations, in many instances, what we start to find, again, historically, is that across the globe, the practice of forced sterilization comes with the term disabilities. It's always about a woman being unable or incapable of rendering clear-cut decisions about her own reproductive choices. And that may be a situation, for instance, during World War II, or actually starting in World War I, where you had a lot of women globally who were encountering men of different cultures through war. And as they say, in war as in peace, what you start to find is that when people cohabitate and they start to have children, the idea of having mixed race children was against the policies of many nations. And even though it may not have been a written policy, it was something that was frowned upon. And it was frowned upon, I say, in a light situation, but the reality is many times violence occurred. And these men were pushed out of these areas, but the women were also labeled at that point disabled. The children would be removed from the single woman who is now left there with children. They would be placed in homes for the feeble minded or for the wayward or for orphans when they clearly have a parent that is there. But because the parent's race and the child's race are disparate at this point, the idea was to keep them separate and then to go in and forcibly sterilize the women to ensure that they did not additionally have mixed race children. So you'll start to see different programs historically that attach disabilities specifically to women to ensure that the race of the nation, the culture of the nation is not disturbed or destroyed through miscegenation, which is race mixing. When we get to the term disabled, how is disability defined? Well, in America, the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913 defined feeble minded people as those requiring care, supervision, or control to protect themselves. Later, the Mental Health Act of 1959 introduced the term moral imbecile, which was used to describe those considered to have a normal intellect, but a deficiency in morality. And one of the documentaries that the Acumen Group will look at on November 4th is another documentary called Subnormal, a British Scandal, where we found that a majority of Black youth in the 1960s were wrongfully labeled mentally or socially defective. Um, the young people were not in carceral spaces, they were in school. But the schools had examinations that they gave the students that were similar to those that were used in feeble-minded homes and those used in prisons to determine the IQ of the child. And the IQ was based strictly upon cultural norms. So if the child is not from England and they don't understand English euphemisms or terminology, they would be considered deficient. And the term used, subnormal, is a decidedly eugenic term. So Acumen continues its research into how these classifications impact the reproductive rights of those young people currently who are now in their 60s, to try and determine exactly how they navigated this system. And so it's a great documentary. So I invite you to join us when we examine the documentary Subnormal. So Belly of the Beast, many of you who saw it again were able to send some notes over to me and to the Acumen Group editors with your questions. And so we appreciate those and we'll get to them. But the synopsis really quickly, Kelly Dillon was sterilized without her consent at the age of 24 while incarcerated in California. Miss Dillon was the victim of domestic abuse and murdered her husband in self-defense. Still, she was placed in prison and she served a term of 15 years for killing her husband. While she was there, she had to take an annual exam, and the examination showed that she had quote unquote abnormal cells in her pap smear. Now, what we find out later on is that 99% of the women who came through this particular prison all had abnormal um, results to their examinations. But we find that the physician who was there was extremely negligent and would do things like eat his lunch while he was doing pap smears. He did not use gloves while he was doing pap smears. There was no hygiene and no sterilized equipment there. So it would give cause and alarm to see a pap smear, quite frankly, that wasn't abnormal just based upon the non-sterile space in which many of the examinations were taking place. Miss Dillon was told that she had abnormal cells and told that based upon that diagnosis, a full sterilization was in order. She told them specifically she did not want that to happen because she intended to have other children. She already had 2 sons. But when she got out of prison, she believed she'd be able to meet someone else, get married, and have additional children. They told her that's fine. They would just go in, do a further examination. If it was found that she had fibroids, they would remove the fibroids, but that would be it. What we find in the story, once again, is that Miss Dillon would end up losing 1/2 of her body weight. She went in at roughly 230 pounds. And at the time that part of the documentary was filmed, she was down to 115 pounds in a matter of months. So clearly something had gone wrong. Something was amiss. And she would find out only after requesting her records, her medical records, which took 6 months to get, even though she was inside the facility, that she had been sterilized without her consent. So how did we get here? The science of better breeding or improving human population by controlled reproduction to increase the occurrence of desirable, heritable characteristics. That sounds like a mouthful, but the bottom line of that is eugenics is a term, it's a science. People keep saying a pseudoscience, but the reality of it is it was a bad science whose theories were, determined were incomplete, erroneous, and false. However, because it fit into many of the racialized and nationalist propaganda of the nations that were being built in the 1830s, 1840s, it made absolute sense that eugenics would literally start to talk about not just breeding better people, but how characteristics like intelligence, criminality, poverty, immorality were passed through DNA. And they weren't using the term DNA at that time, they called it germplasm. But how a person with an alcoholic in the family 5 generations previous could expect to have alcoholics in their family line for successive 10 or 15 generations. And in the same way that eye color or hair texture would be passed from one generation to the next, so would other characteristics, just your basic characteristics. And so it's the idea that we have now where we say nature versus nurture. So when we think in terms of Kelly Dillon, one of the reasons why the prison system would think in terms of sterilizing the women who are in prison is twofold. One, the idea is if you have a woman who's in prison, specifically a woman, it means that the children that she already has are not benefiting from her mothering, which means they're most likely in the care of a foster system or perhaps even negligent relatives. But the mother, the maternal instinct, the maternal influence is not there. And so these children are at a deficit, which means social services or someone else will have to be there to pick up the pieces. It means that these children would be, according to science, these children would have learning issues, they would have emotional issues. And so if a city, a county, a state is looking at minimizing the amount of money they will have to spend on children whose parents, specifically a mother, is incarcerated, the belief is that they go ahead and sterilize that mother, they can eliminate or cut down the ongoing cost and keep them from having to have additional costs added to the coffers if this woman has additional children. The second part of this eugenic stream is that if the woman has done something that would land her in prison anyway, meaning she has a gene for criminality, it means that she's breeding criminals. And there's no way of getting around that. And in breeding criminals, she's also breeding poverty, and she's probably breeding immorality in the process. And so the belief that you can cut off a criminal strain, the idea of a born criminal, you can cut this off by, while this woman is in prison, for one thing, you go ahead and you do a full hysterectomy to ensure that she can no longer have children. To create more civilized, patriotic, and powerful populations, America should restrict marriage between groups of people, segregate or sterilize those with weak genes. That is a eugenic construct. Your Jim Crow laws and your Jane Crow laws all go to a eugenic position that says that all Black people are subhuman. We are a part of a dysgenic race, meaning everything we do is slightly contaminated and not quite normal. It's always a subcategory, it's always lesser than. And so when we hear Black people saying things like, I was always taught that I had to be twice as good or 10 times as good as the white person in order to prove that I am normal. This is where this comes from. A lot of times we don't talk about the science, we talk about the social aspects of eugenics, but not necessarily the science that's driving it. Eugenics 101, really quickly, those with superior stock or possessing great fit genes should only marry and breed with those of similar genetic fitness. Those of superior stock or fit genes should actively work to protect their genetics by avoiding contaminants, including alcohol, drugs, certain foods, behaviors, and people. Again, this is what segregation was about to some extent, making sure, or even redlining when we talk about housing. You want to ensure that you're not on the same side of the tracks as the other people, because if you're socially grouped, at some point you will be sexually grouped, and that's just the language of eugenics. It's always believed that at some point you're going to crisscross, and then you'll start having what's considered to be the third race, which is the marginal folks in the middle. I don't like these terms. I'm just giving you the science of it. So anyone who's considered mixed race is considered to be a marginal group or quote unquote hybrid. The current issue that we're dealing with now, fewer white women under 30 are giving birth in England, Wales, and in the US, quite frankly. The idea of a child-free movement has increased voluntary sterilizations since 2005. And it's one of the reasons now where we're talking a lot about increased populations in certain places where it's a lot of immigrant logic that's going on. There's a lot of, we don't want to talk about critical race theory. It's a lot of things right now where all of a sudden the idea of white people or the national character of the nation being challenged is under attack, is because a lot of people feel like there's footing that's being lost, but it's not a racial footing necessarily. It's a eugenic footing. And so we have to learn the difference in order to know exactly what it is that we're fighting. The other part of eugenics is what's called negative eugenics. Those with inferior stock or possessing poor genes should be segregated from society by placing them in prisons, asylums, reformatories, or ensuring that they're in ghettos or places where there are food deserts, so that there'll always be gaps in education. There'll always be gaps in health that are based upon not having adequate clean water or food, not being able to get decent sleep or have decent housing. Also, those of inferior stock should be kept from reproducing and pushing out similar genetic taint through sterilization. So we started to see where Belly of the Beast makes perfectly good sense to folks who have been doing sterilizations, not just since officially 1907 with the state of Indiana, but going forward into 2019 and 2020 in places like White County, Tennessee, and throughout the state of California. Eugenic classifications. In addition to inheriting your parents' height, eye color, hair texture, and physical features, eugenics says that, again, through that germplasm, things like moral depravity, lying, cheating, theft, sexual depravity, criminality, laziness, all of that fits into this. Now, the other part of this on the social, how the science informs the social. If you look at this chart, what you start to see is that based upon the scale that you're going to use to determine if a person is fit or unfit, or determine what their capacity is, you're going to be given a series of tests. Most of them look like regular IQ tests that we have now, but years ago, these were called strictly eugenic capacity tests. And so depending on how you fared, you can see the mentality of a 3-year-old or under is a person called an idiot, low-grade imbecile, mentality of a 4 to 5-year-old, medium imbecile. Mentally, you have the capacity of a 6 to 8-year-old, high-grade imbecile, a 8 to 10-year-old, and a moron, a 10 to 12-year-old. Many of you have seen these terms, and it's just something you use in everyday language to call someone silly or crazy or simple. But these were actual classifications years ago. And what you see as you pivot to the right side of this chart is that it also tells you how these young people that are tested and what their exam results are lining them up to do for the rest of their lives. So if this test is given to a child and they're in the fifth or sixth grade, they will then be pushed into different categories as far as work and as far as trade, as far as academics, as far as what they're going to do to make a living. And so it is believed that a person with an idiot classification needs to be in a reformatory or someplace where someone else can actually look after them because they don't have the capacity to care for themselves, let alone a child. These are people who would be sterilized emphatically. All right. Those with that are able to do simple menial work, those who are able to do simple manual work, and those who are able to do complex manual work, depending on who the person is that's actually giving the exams, and who the person is, the proctor, or the board at that particular superintendent at that particular facility, they may still be pushed in to have a sterilization, just in case their character could potentially breed someone who is imbecilic or moronic, and there's too many of these type of people around. So it would go to serve the nation if they weren't able to reproduce. One of the things that comes out in this documentary, you hear a nurse say it is less costly for the taxpayers when a young woman comes into a facility to sterilize her without her consent. And then there automatically really is no recourse for her, because in some instances, like with Kelly Dillon, she did not know that the sterilization had taken place until it had taken place. And then it was months later. And in order to challenge it, because she believed, and rightfully so, that there would be repercussions for her still being in the penal system at the time that she filed the lawsuit, she decided to wait until after she had left the prison to actually file the lawsuit. In so doing, she lost her case. But the reality of this is, the recourse for these women who are being sterilized is almost nil. And that is what this documentary is really trying to push forward and explain to people: when your relatives, your loved ones, your neighbors, anyone is placed in a penitentiary and they're there for usually 2 to 3 weeks before they're sent before the prison medical ward to determine, if they're going to be there for a certain amount of time, what their overall health looks like. And it is at that point that other tests are being taken. They're being administered at that point. And those other tests include these eugenic IQ tests, these capacity tests that will go on to determine whether or not these people will be lined up to be sterilized. And this is still going on today. So we have to be really careful not to think of this simply in historical terms. We must use the history to understand what it is that we're dealing with, but we also have to understand that these are policies that are still active today. Just for the record, the state of Vermont 3 days ago decided to apologize for its eugenic sterilization program. How amazing is that? And one of the things that initially comes out of the mouths of the administrators, the legislators of the state, is that we don't have these policies anymore. And the first thing I thought was, no, you absolutely do. They may not manifest themselves in the way that they once did, but as sure as they existed then, they exist now. So the first thing I told the Acumen team was, you need to go when we need to start examining exactly what's going on in Vermont's penal system. We need to determine what's going on in its public health system. We need to see what's going on in its public housing systems. We need to see what's going on in its school system, because chances are all of these have the ability to push people into prisons. And once they're in prisons, you're going to get the exact same thing that you would get in what most people consider to be one of the most liberal states in America, California, which is women being forcibly sterilized or being sterilized without their consent. All right. During the 1960s and 70s, this policy of shifting and utilizing social workers in schools to target families receiving public food, medical aid or whose family members were incarcerated in order to sterilize the girls and women to keep the taxpayers from having to pay for their poor, criminal, or immoral offspring continues to this day. And so I would, challenge you all, please re-screen Belly of the Beast. Watch it as many times as you possibly can. Find out who your legislators are and push them to do the hard work of fighting against this. Globally, there's a pandemic of reproductive abuse. In 2014, the UK's Department of International Development funded forcible sterilizations in the Indian states of Madhya Pradesh and Bihar. Women died after allegedly being lied to about the operations. Many lost their ration cards. So if you're an immigrant and you come into the country, we'll allow you to stay here, but you must be sterilized as a condition of you being allowed into this country to ensure that even though we're being benevolent towards you, even though we're allowing you in, the one thing we don't want you to do is get here, get a foothold in the country, and then begin to change the tone and the culture of the nation by having children and perhaps out reproducing the people who are native born in this space and creating an immigrant population that's abundant. All right. And so we saw this also here in America with the ICE detention, where it was believed that the women there were also being sterilized against their will. Consider the number of children your grandparents had while in places like the Caribbean, Africa, Guyana, Suriname, or in this instance, down south. And then consider the number of increase or decrease if they went to England, if they went to France, or here in America, if they moved from the south to northern or western spaces. If the number decreased, it wasn't just an economic rationale behind that, because you've now moved into a place of opportunity in many instances. So you're making more money. The family is making more money than they ever did before. So what would cause the decrease in the numbers? And a lot of times the decrease came specifically from either public health officials coming in to start talking about modernity and how modern women don't have more than 3 babies. It comes from public health workers, where if a husband loses his job and you must go on public assistance, you'll be told at this point that, number one, your husband cannot reside in the same space if you're receiving public assistance, and to ensure that you're not having additional children that the system will have to pay for, you're encouraged to either take very, very strong, often toxic birth control, or consider having a hysterectomy. U.S. sterilization laws, there have been quite a few. Those that stand out the most for Acumen, Buck versus Bell, 1924. Carrie Buck is told that she must have a sterilization based on the fact that at 14 she is pregnant. The courts dismissed the fact that this is a young girl who was raped by a visiting cousin. So the fact that she's a victim in all of this is of no importance whatsoever. Carrie Buck is then given this whole eugenic read, where basically her mother is also examined. They determine that she's an imbecile, that Carrie is an imbecile, and her daughter, Vivian, is also an imbecile. And so all three were sterilized by the state of Virginia. Before they can get to the actual sterilization, she challenges it, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The 1927 decision upholds the 24 decision, and all three are sterilized. The Mississippi sterilization of 1964, this I spoke with consistently and constantly. I think this needs to be an entire class. Those of you who are interested in Acumen courses, please check the website. This is one you would not want to miss, because this sterilization law in Mississippi goes directly to civil rights. And it was determined that too many Black people wanted rights that they didn't, quote unquote, deserve. And so the reality of it was, years ago, if you wanted to get married, If you were poor, you had to go in to get a marriage license. That marriage license could be denied based upon the fact that you were poor, because the idea was we don't want to breed poverty. So if two poor people want to get married, they're going to reproduce poor children. The sterilization law comes into effect when you have these people still stay in a house together. So they're quote unquote cohabitating. They may get married in a church. The church is one thing. So they're legally married under the Lord, but they're cohabitating and not legally married as far as the law is concerned. So once they start to have children, their children are all considered to be illegitimate. These children are considered to be born out of wedlock. So the Mississippi Sterilization Law of 1964 says that any woman in the state of Mississippi who has a baby out of wedlock can be charged with a felony. It's a felony moral conviction. All right. And these girls, these young women, would face a 3 to 5 year custodial sentence, meaning they had to go to jail for 3 to 5 years. They would be put in the horrific Parchment prison, and they would have to work, for those 3 to 5 years. In order to get around having to spend the custodial sentence in prison at Parchment, the women would still have a felony. But if they decided to have a sterilization process done on them, that procedure would keep them from having to actually do prison time. You would still have the felony conviction, but you would not have to do the prison time. So what we also found over here at Acumen is that Mississippi sterilization law, which again was a direct result of the freedom riders and these folks coming down to Mississippi and challenging unfair laws, also took place in Maryland in the same year. So stick with us because we're working through that. Ralph versus Weinberger, 1974. The laws that we have now for informed consent were brought about by these two young ladies that you see at the top of the page, Minnie and Mary Alice Ralph. These young ladies at 12 and 14 years old were sterilized against their wishes and without the consent of their parents by public health nurses that came to their home, picked them up, took them to the hospital, and basically just performed full hysterectomies on the girls because their neighbors said that, quote unquote, there were too many little boys hanging around their back steps. Because the parents were already poor and living in Alabama, it was believed that they would be a burden on this county, on the state. So even though the girls weren't even sexually active, as a precursor and underage, these girls were forcibly sterilized. We now have the informed consent law based upon an ACLU case, again, Ralph versus Weinberger in 1974. Please note that these young girls, these women, never received any type of compensation for the sterilization, but the rest of the nation can, to some extent, applaud the fact that by challenging what happened to them, we now have an informed consent law. In 2018, White County, Tennessee prison officers and the warden, the superintendent of prisons in Tennessee, offered every prisoner in the state the ability to leave prison early if they would agree to a sterilization. This was both the men and the women. And as soon as the offer was presented, many people said that this could not be considered a forcible sterilization procedure or mandate because the prisoners were being given the option. The reality is, just as if you were enslaved, if you're in a prison situation, the option of being released means that you would often do whatever it is that you have to do in order to get out of prison. After coming under scrutiny for this, 38 prisoners did agree to the sterilizations in order to get out of prison early. The prison officials rescinded the order after the newspapers got wind of it and basically, explained to them that you could not take a person's right to reproduce away from them as a probation or as an early release program offer of getting out of prison. So where do we go from here? For young women specifically, just going to regular doctors' offices. We're still trying to come up with a better name for this, but use the sister system. for all medical appointments. Sometimes when we go to hospitals and doctors, we have what is known as white coat hypertension. We have fear and anxiety about going to doctors. And so, what you need to have is someone else that you trust, a trusted female, preferably older than you, who is there to ask questions, take notes on your behalf, so that while you're trying to process the information, they can also sit with you and help you navigate the terminology and the fact that you have someone that you may not really trust offering you advice. We often talk about getting second opinions and third opinions and fourth opinions. And I think that that's still great. I think that's a wonderful addition to this. But I think that as we start to push forward, we need to actively advocate for one another. And sometimes, again, in all of the stress of being in a doctor's office, you forget what the doctor is saying. You're not clear on things that are being said. And you need to have someone there that you trust, the sister system, where that person is asking and they have the right and the ability, and the doctor understands that in speaking with that person alongside you, that you have someone else advocating on your behalf. Seek legal assistance through pro bono and legal clinics to help you understand laws concerning mental and emotional tests that are being given to your kids. Now, even though we're talking about Kelly and we're talking about prisons, because we have, school to prison pipelines, we have public health to prison pipelines, we have driving while black, we have all of these other things that can eventually lead you into penal spaces. We also have officers who are in schools. When we have teachers and guidance counselors who are also giving mental and emotional tests to children, you as a parent, we as a community need to know what's on those exams. That is your right. All right. So you need to know what's on those tests. You need to find out if they're culturally biased. You need to find out if those tests are sexist. You need to find out if the tests are looking more for an IQ and a eugenic lean to some of the things we spoke of earlier, or if they're really about your child matriculating and all of us being on the same page and getting great jobs and moving on into the future and being great citizens. So please look for assistance, be active in trying to figure out exactly what it is that your kids are learning and how they're being tested. Do not lose contact with incarcerated relatives. Often you are their only legal resource on the outside, who can challenge their abuse. Now, I know, sometimes you try and help out relatives who are in carceral spaces, and it seems like you're hitting a brick wall. The one thing you cannot do is lose communication, though, because if what you see with Kelly Dillon's story is that if she had had someone on the outside looking after her, I don't think it would have gone as far as it did. Her abuse inside that prison. The fact that she could reach out to an attorney at some point through a pro bono clinic, and try and get some information and survey other women in the prisons to find out what was going on, and to establish a pattern of forced sterilizations. All of this, again, is from an attorney who's outside the prison, coming to the prison, though, as an attorney. But when you come to see your relatives in prison, you need to be able to have concrete conversations with them about what is happening inside that prison. When we talk about taxpayers and their money, your tax money is actually going to pay for that prison and the upkeep of your relative there. So you need to know what's going on there. You need to advocate on their behalf. Speak up and speak out candidly about your concerns and experiences. These traumatic reproductive violations impact generations of Black women because of the stigma attached to sterilization. Speak up, because if you don't, the next generation of Black women and girls will be facing similar trauma. Study the history and reach out. You need to understand what eugenics is and how it works. You also need to go on full frontal attack with some of your legislators. Okay. There is not a state in this country that does not have some type of eugenic protocol. We have legislators here And this is either going right over their heads or they're in bed with the folks who are pushing these policies forward. You have to hold people accountable, even if it's not popular. We have to do a better job at advocating for and protecting the rights of those who are marginalized to a point where they have no voice. This is going to conclude the portion of the talk where we're doing the PowerPoint. So I want to thank Tony Warren of Black History Walks, Stacey Palmer, who's my executive virtual assistant. I love her dearly. Dr. Sophia Sparks, Dr. Wilma Leon, as always, Lee Ross, our senior researcher who helped pull all of this stuff together. Please make sure that you check out Acumen Magazine, the Acumen Group, and the many lectures and screenings that we'll be doing for the rest of this year and into 2022. You can visit us at www.theacumengroup.org. Now, I'm going to see if there are any questions that you guys might have to basically go on with much of what we're doing here. All right. So are there any questions? I'm looking for anything that may be in here. Anything? I will tell you, I do have one. I have a couple of questions from some folks that came into our mailbag a couple of days ago. Are sterilizations still happening? Yes. The quick answer to that is absolutely. The sterilizations have never ceased. They're still ongoing. A lot of times, again, based on the IQ examinations that are given, it is again believed to be for the better of the state. Is considered to be something that saves financial resources of the city or the state or the county. And so if you're in a prison, if you have family members that are in prison, it is still routine to have physicians again say that there's something abnormal in the pap smears, or there's something, there's there are fibroids that may be present. Well, African American women are known for having fibroids. So if you're outside of prison and you have fibroids, sometimes the reality is there are many things you can do to rid yourself of those fibroids. Dr. LaJoyce Brookshire has done an amazing job of holistically treating fibroids and ensuring that your diet changes. And she'll talk about the fact that fibroids feed off of sugar and things like that. So there are other ways of dealing with shrinking the fibroids rather than doing a full hysterectomy. And so most Black women, if they look for outside resources, will find an alternative to the sterilizations. So just the fact that you have this doctor was just really creepy in this documentary, but the fact that the sterilizations could take place in such a record number, year after year, month after month, and no one raised the red flag and said, this is bizarre that this many women are taken from the prison into county hospital, and the same procedures are being performed, and there's no oversight. All right. So yes, I believe that if we actually checked the state penal records for most of America's penal systems, what we're going to find is a similar story to what we're seeing in California. I think that it is imperative, once again, that if your loved ones, especially your female loved ones, are in prisons, you must find out what's going on with their health. And where you can advocate for them, do. We have Black representatives everywhere. We have, organizations that talk about reforming people once they're out, returning citizens. But I need to know what's happening with the citizens while they're still incarcerated, because guess what? Your citizenship it doesn't go out the window when you go to prison. You're still a citizen and you have rights. And so we need to ensure that those folks, those relatives, those loved ones, those neighbors, the people you don't even know, because eventually all of us at some point could end up by hook or crook in a detention center or in a space where we don't have the ability to say yes or no. And so we want to believe that it doesn't still happen, but it is still actively happening everywhere. And so we just have to be extremely mindful of where we can advocate and how we can do this. So once again, I think that if you can challenge and start asking again your legislators. For DC, this is a very weird space. Thank you, Stacey, for that question. DC is a weird space because if you get charged with a felony, we don't have a facility in the city for that. So if you're charged with a felony, you're automatically sent out of state. And once your relative is out of state, how do you know what's happening with them? Do you know the what prison they've gone to? Do you know who the representatives are in the state where they've been sent? And so we all have to do our due diligence with this to ensure that, especially with DC residents who may be out of state, where they are and what condition they're in as a whole. Let's see. Are there any legal ramifications for what happened in Belly of the Beast? The quick answer to that is no. There have not been any arrests. There, to my knowledge, there's been no recourse legally for the sterilizations that took place. Once again, all of the information about the physician who was doing pap smears with no gloves on, doing a pap smear, and he's eating a sandwich and dropping crumbs on the lady's feet. Just the malpractice end of it, no. With the sterilizations themselves, they were considered to be quote unquote necessary. So based upon the doctor's recommendations, there was no recourse. There is no legal action. It's clear that it should not have happened. But as you can see, if you watch the documentary, there's also an issue of when these types of cases go to court, if you can get an indictment, a lot of times the juries weigh really, really heavily on the person who's not incarcerated, because those who perpetrated a crime against them are considered to be professionals, and they're considered to have know-how, and they're considered to be legitimate authority. And so because of that, what you end up having are women who are traumatized once again. They're exploited, they're traumatized, there is no recourse, there is no justice for them. And now they're still in that prison in some instances, and the retaliation is real. And so again, the only way to deal with these types of things is to have legislators and folks on the outside of the prison who are actively engaged and working to deal with whatever else is going on inside the prison, and literally working to take these folks down. One of the other questions that we have was about the journalist who actually broke the case open. I will say this again and again and again. One of the reasons why I've always felt it was important as a Black journalist, Black journalists are often called soldiers without swords, because they take those life-altering risks to get to the truth. And so the fact that you had a Black male reporter to jump in his car in a rainstorm to find this doctor, and not to go, because they were ignoring him, not to go to the prison. They enacted HIPAA rules, so he couldn't gain access to the women's medical records, or even just documents that didn't have their names on it, but could explain why there were so many sterilizations taking place and all of this. To show up at this doctor's house in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, to interrogate him about the fact that he had sterilized and authorized the sterilizations of these women is what made me want to be a journalist in the first place. That type of tenacity, that type of drive, that type of what would you die for to ensure that this story is told type of journalism. And we don't have that type of investigative journalism going on too much anymore. And I miss it. And I'm challenging those of you who are journalists who are watching this and who'll see this later. This is what you've been called to do. Okay. Who won the last award and who's sleeping with who? That's not news. This is news. This is, I could go to this man's door and have him shoot me. But I need to find out from him what he's been doing to these women. And I'm going to risk him harming me, calling the police on me, being jailed myself for trespassing. But I'm going to find out what the story is. And it is through this man's tenacity that the physician opened up and actually admitted there are too many of the wrong types of people who are giving birth and having children, and they are a stain on our national character. And if I can sterilize these women, then I will. He said, we are saving the taxpayer loads of money by sterilizing these women without their permission, against their will, and what you're going to do about it. The tragedy of all of that also rings out in the fact that once the story and the investigation and everything is written and everything is brilliant, and we're going to get a rush to get this man locked up, and the court of public opinion was that these women didn't need kids anyway. Most of them on welfare anyway. Most of their kids are dumbing down the school system anyway. Most of their kids are shooting up the streets and tearing up things anyway. They don't need to have children because they don't know how to raise them. And it's just going to be more welfare money that's put out for them anyway. And so based upon that logic, despite the fact that the doctor has committed a crime, he has breached his oath and his protocol as a physician to do no harm. No one was ever arrested. Nothing that happened in Belly of the Beast was considered a crime. And because it was not considered a crime, to your question, Stacey Palmer, yes, the sterilizations continue today. All right. It is a blight, I think, on the character and also the moral compass of this nation. I've been challenging folks in religious and spiritual spaces, in academic spaces, in journalistic spaces, in historical spaces, lawyers, doctors, students. We got to do something about this. And so we're going to keep doing Belly of the Beast and a few other documentaries to try and bring it home to help you understand exactly what it is that we're up against. But you have to do your part. All right. I could do these lectures every day, all day, but you have to do your part. And so, again, I challenge you. You cannot share the link publicly, but email this link. Make sure that other people see Belly of the Beast. Ask your coworkers, your church groups, your sororities and fraternities. Ask them to host screenings so that everyone is able to see this, and then determine what it is that you need to do individually, collectively, as a community, as a nation to fix this. All right. If there are no more questions, are there any questions? Yes, no, maybe. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Those of you who may wish to get a copy of the PowerPoint to go back through, please email me at Shantella Sherman at theacumengroup.org. I'm more than happy to share that information with you. If you all would like to have a Belly of the Beast screening, please. Uh, Dolores Wilson is saying, wait. All right. What you got? You have a question? I'm listening. Both ears. Don't be shy. Come on. Are you typing with one finger? What you got? Eugenics, yes. When you say we have to do something, what do you mean? What can we do about eugenics? Well, first you have to understand exactly what it is and socially where it fits in. Um, the fact that we still have eugenics being taught in schools to some extent through sociology classes, through biology classes, but also the fact that as an adult, you may not know that it's part of your everyday life, like your uh, redlining. That's a eugenic uh, term. It could be in where you live and how you live, where your grocery stores are set up. It could be where your legislators are. It could be how your school systems, what courses, what books are being used in the schools that are around the areas where you live. Almost everything has a eugenic construct in this nation simply because that was the way it was built. Eugenics was built into the fabric. So when we start to have a better understanding of exactly what it is, then we know how to pull it apart and how to challenge it in different ways. If we are not the ones in power, wouldn't we be appealing to the same people who are practicing eugenics on us? No, because this is the thing, and I would encourage you to find a copy of. I'm trying to see if there's one behind me somewhere. In Search of Purity. Okay, if you can find a copy of this book, In Search of Purity actually deals with eugenics that was reconstructed by African Americans. All right. So this is eugenics is not racially white over black, although that is part of its construct. Eugenics is fit over unfit. All right. It's normal over abnormal. And so as long as we can appeal to folks to think in terms of fit over unfit, and we get to tell them what fit is and then tell them what unfit is, we will always, it's a power structure. Absolutely. Absolutely. But power has a tendency to shift. And it shifts, like the British people say, with the small acts. It's the Jamaican thing. It's the small acts. Small acts wielded forcefully and constantly, continuously, is a power in and of itself. The problem now is that years ago, we understood how eugenics played its part in the construction of laws, in the construction of Plessy versus Ferguson, the Dred Scott case. We understood and actually read the law and saw people talking about subhuman people and degenerate populations and how the language started to shift. And so when you had the Kelly Millers, and you had the Mary McLeod Bethunes, they weren't just talking education, but they would go in and use the scientific language of the day, which was eugenic, to break apart many of these theories before they were formulated properly. All right. And breaking them apart. When you start getting Mamie Clark, all right, when you start getting that research on if I have a black doll and a white doll, which one will you choose? you start getting into the construct, not just of race, but the construct of eugenics, which is the fit over the unfit. It's not just that your skin is black, it's that that blackness means something. And so, in order to understand, I don't have a problem with black people. Okay, I have black neighbors, I have a black friend, right? Until that black person moves next door to you. And then what you start to have are not just the belief that white is better and black is a problem, but you have laws that have been in place that say things like, if you're in an all white neighborhood and a black person moves into that neighborhood, your house is now devalued by 30 to 50%. Now, you may not be a racist, but all of a sudden, something that you don't necessarily have money for, because white people don't have money either. Okay. When you working towards something and all of a sudden someone comes in and tells you that the house that you got this mortgage for and you're paying on it and all of this now has been devalued by a system that says this one person moving into this neighborhood because they're subhuman or they're marginal. You have to attack the scientific language in order to understand how the social implications of that scientific information impacts your legal portions over here, impacts your sociology, impacts your housing. So you'll have many white people who, good natured and honestly say, I am not racist. And they're not. But when someone tells me this one black kid moving into the school with me, into the school district where my kid is, will automatically bring down the test scores because black people don't have a capacity to learn beyond the third grade. That is why your standardized tests start in the third grade, because it is believed, and I have the language, the research and the reports. This is what the Acumen Group does. We have the reports from 1910 that are still being used in 2010, that then got used in 2020, all right, that literally say black people don't have the aptitude and capacity to learn beyond the third grade. Whatever their capacity is at the third grade, that is what they're going to be when they're 50. They're never going to get beyond that point. They reach their levels. That's it. And so when you start to understand that, you can challenge things like the bell curve without saying, oh, it's racist. No, it's not racist. It's eugenic. And if you don't understand how to attack eugenics by saying there are people of all groups where if you're going to do what is considered to be exceptional, what is considered to be normal, what is considered to be deficient, you have to understand what that matrix is built around, and then you attack that. This is VP Franklin. Thank you if you're watching this, an amazing scholar who researched this years ago and talked about the tests are designed for the dogs. Please find these journal articles are there. I've never been a fan of Google because I always felt like it was the world encyclopedia that we used to have as kids. And I always told, go to the library and research it individually. But Google now has a system called Google Scholars, which will allow you to get in and actually look at journal articles of the period where you can actually see what the language was then and how that same language is being used now. And so we have to be able to break it apart. But if you don't understand the science behind it, that lends itself and breeds out into these other areas, you're going to have an issue by simply saying racial. The theory of eugenics, but would you say that it was started to control the unfit Black people because we are the only targets? No, absolutely not. And that is one of the biggest misconceptions of eugenics in the first place. Eugenics started out to put white women in their places. Now, it only became an issue for Black people when we started talking about civil rights. And we have a timeline of eugenics and how specifically the sterilization and reproduction and the asylums and homes for the feeble-minded were instituted. And what we have found is that across the board, white women were initially the targets of eugenics, first and foremost. It was already determined that Black people were not redeemable. So as long as you could keep us separate and we didn't contaminate anything, as long as you keep Native American people separate so they didn't contaminate anything, you're okay. As long as you could keep Italians, Irish, all of these other groups in, separate spaces and ghettos, you were fine. Everything is good. But when you start looking at white women left on their own, white women who are moving off of the farm out of rural areas and moving into cities to work in factories. And they got outside of their parental watch, and they basically started drinking and hanging out in beer gardens and partying and cutting their hair. And so you start to see laws that are put in place specifically to quote unquote protect white women and protect white womanhood. And protecting white womanhood, you protect the nation because they are nation builders. And so the language of eugenics is about building a better and a greater nation through the wombs of its women. If white women aren't acting the way they need to act, then you're contaminating the real gene pool as far as they're concerned. As long as they're immigrants and Black people, our job was to be here as exploited people who were to build the nation, but not necessarily benefit from its liberty and its justice and all of this. We were always supposed to be marginal. We only became the targets of these eugenic practices starting late mid to 1940s into the 1950s, when we started talking about civil rights, when we actually, I would say, when we started taking active part in World War I, you can start to see a shift there. And that's when you started having race riots. So we talk about Red Summer. And I always say the Red Summer, if we look at 1919, that's one thing, but you need to go back to 1916, 1917, when World War I, you started having Black soldiers who were showing their manhood and their masculinity. And they were coming to save the day, and they were coming to save the nation, and they were charging in on the white horses. And this was something that white men said, okay, no, okay, you don't get to save the day. It's our jobs to save the day. So based upon that, you also had lots of white women who also started to see Black men as potential husbands, the person who's going to charge in on the white horse and save the day, as potential husbands, as benefactors, as fathers. And they started actively attempting to cross racial lines. And so you start having this concentration of lynching. All right. So it's everywhere where you start to see enfranchisement of Black men that you start to see sterilizations and this protocol of incarcerating people while you're sterilizing Black women and putting them in feeble-minded homes. 1930s, 40s, 50s, you also start having Black men, as they're trying to gain agency coming out of enslavement, 1870 and moving forward. They're starting to work on railroads as Pullman porters. They're starting to get agency, build towns, not just Black Wall Street, but across the nation. We're doing things for ourselves. Everything is going good. The lynchings get started. The chain gangs get started. Slavery without slavery by another name. You start to have these Black men who disappear walking down roads, and they're automatically placed in prisons, put on work gangs. They're working for people like the DuPont tire folks. All right. They've been enslaved again because, again, that 13th Amendment says that you cannot be enslaved unless that little piece there, unless you've been arrested and it's a part of your incarceration. And so these men were literally put back into enslavement. So white women were first and foremost the original targets of the eugenics movement. And so the goal was for them to build a nation. If they weren't going to cooperate, there was going to be a problem. And so by the time you get to the 1920s and you actually have a 13-year period where you have prohibition, that wasn't for white men who have been walking around drinking themselves into a stupor for forever. That wasn't for Black men. That was specifically for white womanhood, to protect it and to keep it safe. Because you can't have the positive eugenics on one side building a nation when the women won't cooperate, and at the same time have the negative eugenics on this side where Black people are supposed to be held in their place, but they're actually gaining agency, creating newspapers and doing all this other stuff. And the scale is starting to tip, not because of anything sinister, but because these white women want their agency at the same time that Black people as a whole want theirs. Any other questions? That was a great question. Thank you, Denoris. I appreciate that. Hey, Lindy Villakazi, how you doing? So yeah, if are there any other questions? Bring them on in. And that's a great question, Denoris. I think that as we again try and work through how eugenics impacts us today. Eugenics is that old school language, that old school world that a lot of people they see, they hear, and they immediately think of something way back when. Charles Darwin, and it's like, yeah, well, Charles Darwin, yes, but if I said late Supreme Court Justice Scalia, you know, when Scalia started talking about whether or not we should have affirmative action in educational policies as far as admission is concerned. And Scalia said he didn't think it was fair because Black people didn't have the aptitude to actually be in these colleges. That is what HBCUs are for, to help the Negroes who basically don't have the aptitude to be in the white schools with the white people. All right. That wasn't 18 anything. That wasn't even 19 anything. We were in the 2000s with that. So the language of it may shift. A lot of things that you thought were dead and buried in the water, they absolutely are not. They never were. It's just that the focus may have shifted to something else, and we stopped talking about it in the same way. All right. Any other questions? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. All right. So I'm going to try and pull the plug again. Let's see if that works. Thank you. Thank you again so much for joining the Acumen Group. We are always grateful and delighted to be with you and present this information because we believe that it is beyond relevant. It is necessary. It is vital that we get a clear understanding of eugenics in modern days so that we understand how to actively work and engage so that we can blow it apart. There is no place for it in a society today. Please join the Acumen Group often. Check on us, send us emails, join our social media pages, talk to us. If you have additional questions, do not be a stranger. That's what we're here for. At this time, American Legacy is still in existence, so I cannot officially say it that way, but the Acumen Group and Acumen Magazine currently is the only printing African American history magazine in the nation. I dare say the world. All right. And if I could say so, we're damn brilliant. So I want to make sure that you get the history that you need with an understanding for what it does currently, not just in February when it's Black History Month. It is currently Black History Month in the UK. All right. Loving every bit of it. And please understand Black History 365. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not just when things happen, not when something's political, not when it hits the headlines. Every day that you walk out of your house, you walk out the same. All right. And so you need to learn how to advocate for yourself, how to protect yourself, how to advocate for others, and how to live beautifully and strong and wonderfully. So please join the Acumen Group whenever you can. Check us out at www.theacumengroup.org. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you adieu until next time. All right. Enjoy your night.